Apparently, everyday life is illegal now. You can't breathe, blink, or exist without accidentally violating some rule written by a bored bureaucrat with too much time and a working pen. And if you think you're safe, oh, you're adorably wrong. 1. A man once discovered he had technically violated a municipal rule against improper fruit display simply by leaving a banana on the dashboard of his parked car, a rule written decades earlier to discourage roadside vendors but still enforced on anyone bold enough to own produce with visible confidence. And he only learned of it after being politely informed that his car had been flagged as a potential unlicensed fruit stand in operation, which is a fascinating way of saying the city feared he might suddenly pivot from errands to becoming the world's smallest banana merchant. The best part is that the ticket stated he had created an unauthorized commercial environment, as if a lonely banana lounging in the sun was a full-scale grocery conspiracy, proving that sometimes you don't need to break laws. Laws will break themselves just to feel included in your day. 2. A woman found herself violating an obscure noise ordinance after her garage door made a squeak that the city measured at above acceptable hinge frequencies, a regulation that emerged during the 1970s when one suburban street waged a campaign against mechanical whining, a phrase that sounds like it should describe a malfunctioning robot, but instead targeted homeowners who dared to open their garages without conducting a full orchestral warm-up beforehand. The resulting citation politely suggested she arrange regular lubrication visits, making it sound like she was running a spa for hardware, and her neighbors had the pleasure of watching government employees document the decibel levels of a squeaky hinge as if they were investigating alien contact, which really demonstrates how any innocent noise can be rebranded as a criminal offense the moment a clipboard enters the room. 3. A guy unintentionally violated a fishing regulation just by walking near a lake while holding a sandwich, because the local wildlife rules considered possession of bait within casting distance to be equivalent to active fishing, meaning a person could legally break the law by being hungry in the wrong geographic zone. This rule originated in the 1920s when wardens were tired of arguing with locals who insisted they were just holding worms recreationally. So lawmakers decided to classify anything remotely edible as an implied fishing attempt, which is how a turkey sandwich achieved the same legal power as a bucket of nightcrawlers. The man in question received a friendly warning that his lunch was creating the appearance of angling activity, establishing the precedent that carbs can commit crimes, and revealing that some regulations truly believe food has intentions. 4. One employee in an office complex was informed that he had violated the building's unauthorized vertical movement policy because he took the stairs during hours designated as elevator priority time, a rule crafted by an HR team that allegedly wanted to prevent hallway congestion, but instead created a dystopian fitness schedule enforced by laminated posters. The security guard explaining the violation looked apologetically confused, as if he also questioned why a grown adult was being punished for the radical act of climbing steps like a medieval villager. And the entire ordeal clarified that modern corporate life sometimes treats walking as a subversive activity, the kind of rebellious behavior usually associated with revolutionaries rather than people wearing lanyards. The employee wasn't fined, but he did receive a memo reminding him that stairwell enthusiasm must align with corporate flow guidelines, a sentence so bureaucratic it practically folds itself into an origami swan of absurdity. 5. A customer at a bookstore once triggered a rarely enforced rule forbidding unattended reading, which sounds like a philosophical statement, but actually meant the store required all browsing customers to either hold the book or return it to the shelf instead of leaving it briefly on a table while checking their phone. This relic of mid-90s retail paranoia emerged during a period when managers feared roving herds of reckless browsers scattering paperbacks like feral raccoons, so the rule still haunts modern stores despite contributing nothing to public safety or literacy. The employee who cited the customer apologized profusely while explaining that leaving a paperback on a table technically constituted display interference, implying the book's placement was a threat to the structural integrity of capitalism. And what makes it even better is that the customer hadn't even left the building, just the chair, which apparently still triggered the system like an alarm designed by someone who deeply mistrusted casual reading. 6. A person once unknowingly violated a state regulation by mowing their lawn in a manner suggestive of commercial landscaping, a phrase so vague it could apply to anyone who owns a lawnmower with a functioning engine. The law was intended to prevent off-the-books lawn care businesses from operating without permits, but in practice, it meant a neighbor could accuse someone of being too efficient, which is arguably the pettiest possible crime. The citation informed the mower that their straight lines and consistent pace indicated professional intent, suggesting the government felt threatened by a citizen demonstrating above-average tidiness. And while the rule technically allowed appeals, the appeals board mostly existed to pretend that lawn care jurisprudence made sense, resulting in one of those magical bureaucratic moments where ordinary household chores accidentally mimic tax evasion. Savsiu, a man received a warning for violating a municipal photography rule that prohibited aiming electronic devices in the direction of public fixtures, which the city insisted was not an anti-surveillance measure, but a way to reduce liability claims involving light poles, leaving everyone confused about how photography endangers metal structures. He hadn't even taken a picture. He had simply lifted his phone to check reception, but the motion evidently resembled a fixture scan, a term invented by lawyers who clearly hadn't met a real photographer in decades. The rule originally emerged after one person fell while trying to photograph a decorative lamppost and sued the city, prompting officials to decide the best solution was preventing anyone from pointing a camera at anything ever. The man was let off with a courtesy reminder that public fixtures should not be electronically engaged, a poetic way of saying the city believes lamp posts deserve privacy. 8. A woman unintentionally broke a housing code stipulation requiring that all curtains visible from the street maintain aesthetic harmony, a phrase that transforms ordinary fabric into a matter of civic responsibility. Her crime was owning joyfully patterned curtains featuring bright oranges and teal shapes, which apparently clashed with the neighborhood's designated palette of muted earth tones, because nothing terrifies local committees more than color with personality. An inspector left a notice describing the curtains as visual disruptions, implying they were staging a coup against suburban uniformity. The woman was given 30 days to replace them or seek decorative guidance, a sentence that manages to be both condescending and strangely threatening, and the entire situation made clear that some communities enforce decor rules with the same gravity normally reserved for nuclear containment protocols. 9. A person accidentally violated a bicycle ordinance by walking beside their bike instead of riding it in a designated cycling zone, because the law defined a bike in motion as any bike whose wheels were touching public pavement, regardless of whether a human was actually propelling them. This meant the act of gently guiding a bicycle was legally equivalent to operating one at full speed, which is an impressive stretch of logic even for traffic laws. The rule was intended to reduce congestion, but mostly punished cautious individuals who preferred not to crash into toddlers. When approached by an officer, the person was advised to either ride the bicycle or remove it from pedestrian space, essentially demanding they pick a lane in life, athlete or furniture mover. And the whole situation beautifully highlights how rules often solve problems no one had by creating new problems for everyone else. 10. A guy unknowingly violated a noise restriction that prohibited excessive celebratory sound because he cheered too loudly during a televised sports game, a rule created during a wave of neighborhood complaints in the early 2000s when disgruntled residents attempted to outlaw enthusiasm. The regulation measured sound levels in decibels but defined celebratory tone with language so subjective that an opera singer warming up would be legal, but a football fan expressing hope would not. An officer knocked on his door to explain that yelling "yes" at the winning touchdown crossed the threshold of domestic event exuberance, turning him into a temporary criminal for experiencing human emotion. The man apologized out of pure confusion, while the officer awkwardly read from a script that made cheering sound like a controlled substance. And truly, nothing captures the fragility of suburban peace like regulating happiness with a sound meter. 11. One amateur baker broke a decades-old cottage food regulation by transporting cupcakes in the passenger seat of her car without a food-grade containment barrier, a phrase that makes pastries sound like radioactive waste. She had simply placed them in a cardboard box, unaware that the law required either a cooler or a properly certified container, as if cupcakes are known escape artists capable of contaminating the upholstery. The rule originated from a single food poisoning incident in the 1980s, after which lawmakers decided dessert transportation needed the seriousness of hazmat operations. She was thankfully only given a warning, but the officer's explanation suggested that her frosting might pose an existential threat to public safety. proving once again that bureaucracy will never miss an opportunity to overreact to baked goods. Number 12. A customer unknowingly violated a store's no loitering while deciding policy, simply by pausing too long in front of a shelf of cereal, a rule that likely originated when some manager realized people standing still do not generate revenue. The employee tasked with enforcing this policy apologized profusely, while explaining that the customer's extended contemplation period registered on their internal surveillance review as decision stagnation, a term that sounds like a medical diagnosis but is actually an official code for thinking too long. Apparently, the store believed that hesitation is a gateway drug to shoplifting, because nothing says criminal mastermind like someone struggling to choose between granola clusters and honey flakes. The customer was politely asked to commit to a product or broaden the aisle, which is a poetic corporate way of saying thinking is permitted only if it's profitable. 13. A guy once violated a historic preservation guideline by placing a modern metal watering can on his porch, an act considered architecturally disruptive because the neighborhood was designated a heritage district where only period-appropriate containers could touch visible surfaces. Enforcement officers declared the watering can incompatible with the visual narrative, as though it threatened to rewrite history through hydration. The original intention of the rule was to prevent residents from installing plastic furniture that clashed with colonial storefronts, but over time it evolved into a full-blown campaign against anything remotely contemporary, turning porches into archaeological exhibits curated by unpaid homeowners. The man was told he could keep the watering can only if it remained non-visible to public vantage points, essentially forcing it into exile like a metal political prisoner, proving that sometimes laws care more about props than people. 14. A person inadvertently broke a commuter rail rule about occupying seats in a manner inconsistent with intended design, simply by sitting slightly sideways, a posture the transit authority apparently saw as a rebellious act threatening the moral fabric of public transportation. The enforcement officer politely explained that seats were engineered for forward-facing alignment, and deviations created passenger flow unpredictability, a phrase that makes sitting comfortably sound like a threat to national security. The rule was drafted years earlier to prevent people from lying across multiple seats, but interpretation has expanded with the enthusiasm of a committee that never met a boundary it didn't want to redraw. The commuter adjusted their posture while contemplating the strange universe in which legroom has legal consequences, demonstrating how transit rules often turn normal human comfort into contraband. 15. A woman once violated an obscure digital signage ordinance by standing too close to an interactive kiosk, because proximity sensors detected her as lingering engagement, a term that sounds like a romantic subplot, but is actually a designated code for blocking ads. The city had partnered with a marketing firm that convinced officials that passersby must move at a predetermined pace to ensure optimal advertising impressions, transforming public walkways into monetized hamster tracks. When approached by an attendant, she learned that standing still within the sensor zone triggered a warning because it disrupted data flow, implying the kiosk's emotional well-being mattered more than her personal space. The attendant, visibly embarrassed, explained the rule was written to protect advertising efficiency, confirming that humanity has officially lost an argument to a screen. She apologized, stepped back, and resumed walking, leaving behind a machine that apparently requires humans to behave like well-calibrated metrics. 16. A man once violated a city park rule banning unauthorized ground contact simply by lying on the grass, because the park's risk management department had apparently decided gravity was a liability and horizontal humans were a public safety threat. The regulation dated back to a lawsuit from the 90s when someone fell asleep under a tree and tried to sue the city for excessive shade. So now every park ranger has to patrol like a hall monitor, making sure people remain upright at all times. The man was politely told he could sit but not recline, which is a truly inspiring distinction that suggests parks are for relaxation as long as your spine remains at a 90-degree angle. He complied, of course, because arguing with a laminated rule sheet is like arguing with a toaster. No matter how wrong it is, it's not going to apologize. And at some point, you just accept that public grass has rules now. 17. A woman discovered she had unknowingly broken an airport regulation requiring continuous forward motion in security-adjacent walkways because she stopped briefly to adjust her shoe, prompting a TSA agent to inform her that pausing in that specific carpeted rectangle constituted flow disruption, a phrase that makes her mild discomfort sound like she blocked a major shipping canal. The rule was introduced to reduce congestion, but it mostly punishes anyone whose footwear has opinions, and the agent's explanation felt like watching someone recite instructions from a malfunctioning robot that only communicates in bureaucratic poetry. She nodded, apologized to the sacred walkway, and resumed walking with the frantic determination of someone trying to avoid triggering the next chapter of the rulebook, which surely includes penalties for breathing in a rhythm inconsistent with national security interests. 18. One office worker got written up for violating a corporate compliance rule about unauthorized desk-level heating because he plugged in a tiny USB hand warmer, a device so weak it barely warmed the air molecules directly in front of it. The company classified all heating devices as fire-adjacent electronics, even though this particular one had about the same output as a slightly overachieving potato. HR explained, with the solemn authority of someone teaching fire safety to toddlers, that even minimal heat sources pose unpredictable risks, as if the hand warmer might spontaneously develop ambition and burn down the building. The employee had to sign a form acknowledging his awareness of thermal policy, which is the kind of sentence that makes you wonder when workplaces collectively decided comfort is unacceptable unless it involves suffering in exactly the temperature the CEO prefers. 19. A person once violated a regional train rule stating that snacks with notable scent signatures are prohibited during peak hours after opening a bag of barbecue chips whose aroma apparently offended an entire row of commuters. The conductor approached with the kind of caution generally reserved for bomb diffusers, explaining that the chips had crossed the threshold of olfactory disruption, a term that sounds scientific but really means someone on the policy team hates flavor. The regulation was originally intended to prevent passengers from eating entire meals on board, but it has expanded into a crusade against anything more aromatic than cardboard. The passenger sheepishly closed the bag, and half the car watched with the intensity of people witnessing a hostage negotiation between civilization and a snack, proving once again that public transit rules now function as personality tests for whoever wrote them. 20. A driver accidentally broke a local traffic rule about inconsistent directional signaling simply by tapping the turn signal while checking a street sign, which authorities classify as misleading communicative intent, apparently believing that turn signals express emotional honesty rather than simple mechanical blinking. The law originated in the 1950s during a wave of road rage incidents blamed on ambiguously timed blinkers, a phrase that suggests motorists were having deep existential crises about other people's intentions. An officer pulled the driver over to explain that signaling without confirming the turn constitutes a false indication, making it sound as though he had lied to the roadway community. The driver nodded politely, perhaps contemplating the reality that a tiny lever in a car now holds more legal weight than most political speeches. 21. A customer unknowingly violated a gym policy banning excessive mirror proximity by stretching a little too close to a full-length mirror, triggering a staff member to remind him that mirrors are high-traffic reflection zones, a term that suggests people are expected to treat them like expressways for egos. The rule was meant to reduce congestion during busy hours, but enforcement mostly targets timid stretchers who have no intention of admiring themselves, while the most dedicated flexors seem to receive diplomatic immunity. The staff member recited the policy with the weary tone of someone who has explained the same absurd guideline hundreds of times, perhaps questioning why a facility full of heavy metal objects is less dangerous than someone standing 20 inches closer to a mirror than allowed. The customer apologized and relocated, leaving behind a mirror that, despite being an inanimate slab of glass, apparently requires carefully coordinated traffic choreography. 22. A woman once violated a campground rule requiring quiet utensils when she cooked breakfast using a metal spatula that made a perfectly ordinary clinking noise against the pan, a sound the campground's handbook described as disturbance-inducing metallic resonance, as though she were summoning a dragon instead of making scrambled eggs. The rule was introduced after one particularly dramatic camper complained that morning cooking noises were emotional harassment, and for reasons unknown, the campground took this feedback as gospel and declared war on cookware. When the ranger issued the warning, he looked simultaneously apologetic and exhausted, as if even he questioned why spatulas now fall under noise regulation. The woman switched to a wooden spoon and carried on, silently acknowledging that the wilderness no longer fears bears or storms. It fears breakfast sounds. 23. A man unintentionally broke a city rule prohibiting unsanctioned water movement when he used a broom to sweep rainwater off his driveway, because the local code considered this act to be redirecting municipal runoff, a phrase that suggests he was interfering with Mother Nature's plumbing permit. The rule came from an overreaction to a case where someone built elaborate channels to divert water into a neighbor's yard. But now, even a broom pushes the boundaries of environmental rebellion. An inspector approached to explain that driveway water must follow natural exit paths, implying the city has a spiritual relationship with puddles. The man listened patiently, broom in hand, perhaps wondering when society decided that moving rainwater counts as a subversive environmental act requiring oversight. 24. A shopper once violated a supermarket rule stating that sampling must reflect actual purchase intention by tasting a grape without explicit approval, prompting an employee to calmly explain that grape tasting constitutes unauthorized pre-consumption, a phrase that manages to sound both deeply legal and deeply ridiculous. The rule stems from corporate fear that customers will snack their way through the produce aisle like polite locusts, so even a single grape is treated as evidence of a broader crime spree. The shopper apologized and offered to buy the entire bunch, but the employee insisted company protocol required a verbal reminder about fruit integrity, as if grapes possess emotional boundaries. The entire encounter lasted 30 seconds, but perfectly captured how modern shopping has become a delicate dance between hunger and surveillance. 25. A person once triggered a municipal fine for violating the rule against unregulated decorative lighting by wrapping a single strand of twinkle lights around a mailbox, a detail the city classified as electrical ornamentation on non-approved structures, which implies the lights were carrying out a covert mission. The rule was designed to prevent fire hazards, but somewhere along the way evolved into a crackdown on joy, forcing residents to request permission before expressing any seasonal whimsy. An inspector photographed the offending lights, as if building a case for a courtroom drama about festive misdemeanors, and left a cheerful notice explaining that unapproved illumination compromises visual consistency, suggesting the city fears twinkle lights more than potholes. The resident removed them, presumably while contemplating the strange world where a mailbox needs legal clearance to sparkle. 26. Someone once broke an obscure office rule about unauthorized scent distribution, simply by wearing a mildly citrus hand lotion that drifted an entire 3 feet into shared airspace, immediately triggering a supervisor to issue a gentle reminder that fragrances must be corporate neutral, a phrase that makes human skin sound like a brand hazard. The rule came from a dispute years earlier when 2 employees went to war over competing perfumes, and management decided the safest compromise was eliminating all scents except the natural aroma of office carpet. The lotion wearer was baffled, the supervisor was embarrassed, and the entire floor smelled faintly like passive-aggressive oranges, which is arguably the perfect scent for corporate life. After that day, the hand lotion lived in the owner's desk drawer like contraband awaiting better times. 27. A man violated a city square rule prohibiting improper bench utilization. After he turned sideways to rest his arm on the back of the bench, a posture city officials claimed disrupted intended seating geometry, as though benches have emotional traumas that require consistent human alignment. The regulation emerged from a misguided attempt to limit people from lying across benches, but enforcement tends to target anyone whose posture displays even a shred of personality. An officer approached to deliver a warning with the resigned tone of someone who knows they are policing furniture etiquette, and the man complied by returning to the officially approved forward-facing position, which made him look less like a human resting and more like an animatronic waiting for instructions. The bench, of course, remained silent, possibly judging everyone involved. 28. A person accidentally broke a library rule banning non-research keyboard activity by typing too quickly on a public computer while responding to an email, because the staff believed fast typing created disruptive acoustic bursts, a description that transforms ordinary keystrokes into a percussion performance. The rule technically exists to discourage gaming and loud messaging, but librarians have discretion to enforce it whenever someone appears excessively energetic, which is arguably the most librarian way to police anything. The staff member asked the patron to reduce typing velocity, a phrase so absurd it deserves its own museum display. The patron slowed down to a snail-paced tap-tap-tap, producing the kind of typing rhythm normally associated with existential dread, which is probably the exact emotional atmosphere libraries want. 29. A homeowner unknowingly violated a residential landscaping rule requiring seasonally appropriate flora by planting a cactus in a region that apparently prefers shrubs suffering from seasonal depression. The rule dictated that all visible plants must reflect local aesthetic heritage, which sounds like patriotic propaganda aimed at bushes. An inspector left a courteous but ominous note explaining that the cactus constituted environmental dissonance, as though it were an outspoken political dissident rather than a spiky plant minding its own business. The homeowner was given options: remove the cactus or petition the review board for a variance, a process that allegedly takes months and requires photos, diagrams, and something called a botanical compatibility statement. The cactus stayed for 2 days before being exiled to the backyard, where it presumably continues its quiet rebellion out of public view. If these rules didn't break your spirit, congratulations. You're already illegal somewhere. Drop your own ridiculous encounters below, vote for the dumbest one, and hit subscribe before someone invents a rule against it.